There are some beautiful tactics in this game. Stick around, it's a lot of fun. I'm looking at the game between Hikaru Nakamura and Alireza Firouzja from day 3 of the Skilling Open. Now this was the final day of the round robin section. Now this was the day of the big cut-off. 16 players, and at the end of day 3, 8 would go home and 8 would qualify for the quarterfinals. And this game had quite a bearing on the final standings. So Hikaru Nakamura with the white pieces. He played e4. He didn't have such a great day yesterday in day 2, but he was catching up on day 3. And we've already seen that Firouzja was playing some amazing chess and was really in contention for one of those top 8 places. Now, to Karakan, Firouzja rather likes this opening with black, and Hikaru is playing the main, or one of the main lines. You could say the old main line against the Kara. So this bishop is just kind of sniping from the side, so it's good to exchange that one off. And black exchanges and plays e6. Now black's pawn position looks, well, the whole position looks a little bit passive, but actually that pawn formation is like a very strong shell. Might be rather backward, but trying to knock through that is not easy. Now you might recall that Firouzja had exactly this position in the Stavanger tournament just, well, a month or so ago actually. And there Duda played bishop d2, and they had a wild game where Firouzja had castled on the king side, Duda castled on the queen side, but Firouzja managed to get a really strong attack on the queen side. Now, I have no doubt that Nakamura was aware of that game, and instead, very quickly, he played bishop f4 instead of bishop d2. So, obviously, the bishop is on a more active square. It controls very nice diagonal, taking away the c7 square away from the queen, but also controlling b8 as well. So black could just play knight f6 and bishop e7 and castle, but white is very active there. Instead, queen a5 check. There's a tricky little move. Now, it's very easy to block the check. You could play c3, but it means that it's difficult for white to castle queenside because that pawn is going to be en prise. So bishop d2 instead from Nakamura. Now, instead of retreating the queen, bishop b4. Now, if those bishops are exchanged, then that's what black wants. It's check, the pawn is attacked, and you have to put the queen in the way. Well, black will exchange queens in a flash, and there's no difficulty for black at all. So c3 knocks the bishop back. And now pawn to c4 pushes the queen away. Could play bishop b4, but that one's not quite so nice. With the idea of coming in here, maybe sometimes white can even play c5. So after c4, queen is attacked, it dropped back to b6. Looking at that b pawn. Now white could castle queenside here. It's the kind of aggressive move that usually Nakamura really likes. But actually with the pawn on c4, that leaves the king a little bit drafty. And pretty soon it's going to be easy for black to break open the position. Well, after castling queenside or kingside actually. So after queen b6, Nakamura played bishop c3. It's a nice square for the bishop. Knight f6. And now knight e5. It's one of those typically aggressive moves from Nakamura. He loves to go forward. He does not have a reverse gear. You know, could just castle kingside there. But he likes to put pressure on his opponent. We know how strong he is at rapid play and blitz. You know, it's his real speciality. And the reason he's so successful is that he moves quickly, he plays really actively, he takes the fight to his opponent. That doesn't always work in classical chess, where your opponent has more time to think through the defense. But in a fast time limit, where the opponent doesn't have so much time to reflect, this is really dangerous. Optimism pays off. Rook d8 from Firouzja, threatening to take that knight. Of course, there's a pin, so the queen just nudges back to e2. Now, black could castle here, but instead, I think it's an interesting move. Firouzja decides this is a strong piece. I think it is a good piece. It kind of glues white's position together. So he decided to exchange off that bishop. Castles kingside from Nakamura. Firouzja exchanged and played castles kingside. Well, we can kind of take stock here. They've played 19 moves. Both sides have only just castled. That's quite unusual. Nakamura has a nice knight on the outpost. He also has greater control of the board. He has more space because those pawns carve out territory. Black is still behind the first 3 ranks. But that pawn looks a little bit weird on h5. It's certainly not going anywhere. There's no chance of an attack against black's king. That knight I also don't particularly like. It doesn't have many opportunities. However, white does have the chance to maybe get a bit of play down the b file. Let's see, and how exactly is black breaking out? Well, let's see. Rook b1 attacks the queen. Looks reasonable. Queen a5 is possible. I can understand why he didn't want to allow that, because white has some activity by taking there. But queen c7 I think is a good move. Holds everything together, puts a little bit of pressure here. So f4, there we go. Hikaru's forward gear in operation again. It's funny. He just can't help himself. Pawns just get thrown forward. And these pawns don't look very attractive, actually. It also means that white's king is just a little bit exposed now. And I like Firouzja's next move. Pawn to c5. Starting to put a little bit of pressure on this pawn constellation. This is the fight back. Queen f3. The queen claims a nice diagonal. And there's a threat to take here. Knight b6, very reasonable. Blocks the b file here. A little bit of pressure on the c pawn and also on the d pawn. So now things are getting serious. Well, queen f2 is possible to defend that, but you can see, well, does white really want to have to defend it? A maneuver I like is knight c8. With the potential to come to d6 and f5, or maybe e7, f5. Reminds me of a maneuver in a World Championship game. Tal Botvinnik, World Championship match 1960. Tal eventually won a game with white. Botvinnik's king was over here somewhere. But Botvinnik had this same maneuver to come to f5 and to get a trade and maybe potentially to get the knight in on a good square. I think it's really hard for white to actually generate sufficient attacking chances from this position, and I think you have to play very accurately to hold. I prefer black here. But anyway, Nakamura played rook d1 to hold the d pawn. Knight fd7. So this is logical, putting pressure on the knight on e5. And that means this pawn could be vulnerable. Knight e4. So that knight takes the chance to move back into the center. Pawn takes pawn on d4. The game is really reaching its climax in this position, actually. You can see Hikaru typically has come forward with his pieces. Pawns, knights, queen. His rooks are connected and active. But these pawns are potentially vulnerable. And also white's king doesn't look brilliant somehow compared to black's. How would you play here with black? I'll have a little slurp of tea and you have a think about that. Black to play. Well, black can take a pawn in two different ways. Firouzja went for f5, but I think he should have taken here and then played queen takes c4. Now I can sort of understand why he perhaps didn't want to go in for this, because after knight d6, that knight has found a good square and it's starting to get a bit random. You know, that rook will break through here, but I don't think black has any difficulties in this position, and I would even say has some winning chances. If those rooks, once those rooks are exchanged, then I think I prefer this knight on d5 to the knight on d6, and you know, these pawns are potentially weak. But maybe Firouzja was looking for more. Maybe he felt that white, with that active knight, had somehow enough play in that position with the knight on d6. Instead, he played f5. Now, that's a really ambitious move. And he wins a pawn with this. The knight has to move. Well, if it goes backwards, then this is going to be very serious and black will take here. So knight c5. So Nakamura gives up a pawn and puts the king on h2. He knew he was going to lose a pawn, but what Nakamura has done is give that pawn away very cleverly. Yes, black is a pawn up, but actually the position has changed. And that knight on e5 is a wonderful piece. And with that pawn move, actually black's king position has been compromised, as we're about to see. And this position is really not so clear. First thing first, it's black to move. If black takes another pawn, then knight d7 wins material. Thank you very much. Knight fork. So that's why Firouzja just brought the queen back, and that covered the b7 pawn. Now, let me show that. That defends the pawn. a4, excellent move from Nakamura. Once again, he can only play with a forward gear, but he knows that in this position that is absolutely right. You can't rest on your laurels here. You have to keep playing actively. You don't allow black to consolidate that extra pawn. You've got to keep the pressure on. So obviously, threat to play pawn to a5, push the knight out of the way, and try and break through on b7. And that could be very serious now that that 7th rank, or the 2nd rank, depending on which way you're looking at it, has been exposed after the f-pawn has advanced. That's why whenever you advance the f-pawn, it raises the stakes. Now, here, Firouzja exchanged on d1. I just want to show you an incredible variation that would occur if black played a5. A very plausible move to block the pawn on a4. Now, what about this? c5 again. White goes forward. Now, the best for black is to play here, and then white definitely has compensation here. You double on the b file and attack this one. And that knight, as I mentioned, is a really beautiful piece in the middle of the board that just really dominates key squares in black's position. Anyway, we're looking at c5. Now, I just want to repeat, this did not happen, but I want to show you this because it's great. Queen takes c5. Rook takes, and now queen b7. And this is actually winning for white. Now, I won't go into enormous detail, but if knight d5, then queen f7 is actually really strong for white, followed by potentially rook b7. So, in this position, knight d7. And here's a clever move. If knight takes knight, then queen d4 is actually still okay for black. But here's the trick. Beautiful trick. Queen takes knight. Rook takes. Rook b8 check. The king has to come up here, and knight g6. And white is winning because rook h8. Mate is threatened, and black can only delay that by putting pieces in the way. What a fantastic queen sack. It's somehow a little bit out of the blue. So that's the kind of danger that black is in. In fact, black's king, you can see, is really rather boxed in with the knight and the pawn on h5. Anyway, Firouzja exchange rooks. And here, well, he has to play a5 to block out that pawn. Instead, he played rook d8. And now, again, a beautiful tactic. So this did happen. This was the game. And Hikaru Nakamura did sacrifice his queen. Queen takes pawn. This is wonderful stuff. So obviously must have come as a complete shock to Firouzja. So first things first, if rook takes rook, then queen takes queen. Handy that that king is off the back rank actually on h2. Very secure. So after queen here, black has to take. Rook takes rook check. King h7, and then once again this mating net. Knight g6 threatening rook h8 mate. There's only one way out. Black can survive this time. Queen c8. This is the game continuation. And now, sadly, white has to give up the rook. But they've exchanged down into an endgame where material is now even. So Nakamura's won his pawn back through queen takes b7. Material is even, but actually this is a completely winning position for white. That king is miles away. And you can see that knight. It is completely dominated by white's pieces. Let's just have a look and see what would happen if black attempted to activate that knight. So a6, white's king threatens to steam over towards the middle and the queen side. Knight a7 and knight e7. And once again, that knight, I mean, this is a stunning position. It's a beautiful position. Look, that knight dominates black's knight, but it also dominates the king. I mean, that is the hardest working knight in professional chess. Absolutely beautiful. So after c5, Firouzja brought his king over. It's the only thing he can possibly try. And white rushed his king over into the middle. The problem is with the pawn on f5, there's always going to be an entry route. And if king c6, then, well, this knight is what an incredible job it's performing here. And black cannot prevent knight takes e6, followed by knight takes g7, followed by knight takes f5, followed by knight takes h6. It's gone completely. So in this position, king d4 played. a6, the only thing to do, tried to bring that knight out. King e5, but, well, this is absolutely hopeless. If knight a7, once again knight f8, picking up this pawn, that pawn, that pawn, that pawn, it's gone completely. So king c6, king takes, and now white's king bursts in. And here, Firouzja resigned. Nakamura just takes here, moves the king back, and steams the pawn down to get a new queen. Wow. I love the different elements in this game. First of all, Nakamura was basically just playing active moves, playing forward. Beautiful trick, lovely queen sacrifice. And then, there we go, that queen sack, queen takes b7. All to reach this wonderful endgame where that knight completely dominates black's pieces. Well, together with the pawn as well. Really nice from Nakamura, and that win actually was crucial because at the end of the day, Nakamura came joint first with Magnus Carlsen. Firouzja didn't make the cut. I feel really sorry for him. He played some amazing games, won some beautiful games, but he didn't make it. He just slid out at the end. So Nakamura will play MVL in one of the quarterfinals. Tomorrow, the big matchup in the quarterfinal is Magnus Carlsen against Anish Giri, who only made the cut by the skin of his teeth. I look forward to that. Thanks for watching.